Hey up, folks. If you are an ordinary person, probably the worst thing that can happen to you, or one of the worst things that can happen, is that the state decides to send you to prison, especially if you haven't done anything. If you're a political agitator, Tommy Robinson springs to mind, then it's quite likely that the best thing that can happen to you is that you go to prison. The reason for this is quite straightforward. Prison tends to legitimize the writings of, well, prisoners. We're far more interested in Tommy Robinson and his communications from prison than we ever would be if he was writing from, I don't know, a holiday in Benidorm. Now, that's true across the board. How many people would have read the prison writings of Antonio Gramsci if he'd been writing from his house in Rome? Probably very few. It's precisely because he was a prisoner that his words had a resonance. Richard Nixon was a politician who was, well, aware enough to understand this. He speculated to Henry Kissinger in the last days of his presidency that he could very well end up in jail. Actually, he was in no danger, but that's not the point. And he then went on to muse that some of the best political writings had been carried out by men who were in prison. And he said that at least he would have the peace and quiet in prison to write his version of events. Hitler wrote in prison, as of course did a very famous political prisoner in the United States in the mid 20th century, Martin Luther King. Now, when King was arrested by the Alabama authorities in early 1963, they had the common sense to realize that locking up King was not going to be the be all and end all. They had to prevent him communicating to his followers. The same is true of Tommy Robinson, of course. So they locked him up and refused him access to writing materials. His lawyers challenged that, but that took time to resolve. So he's isolated from everybody and he doesn't have pen and paper, so he can't communicate with anybody. The prison was not passing messages on to him. It looked like he was going to be forgotten about. That was the attitude of the Alabama authorities. Unfortunately for them, the cons were on King's side, and one of them gave him a newspaper which contained an open letter written by a group of white clergymen criticizing his campaign of non-violent lawbreaking, which essentially is what King was doing in Alabama. King was outraged by this and he managed to scrounge a pen off somebody and he began to write a reply to the white clergyman in the margins of the newspaper. When he'd filled every available space in the paper, the newspaper was smuggled out again by friendly cons, and it was given to a clergyman on the outside named Wyatt Walker. Now, the Reverend Walker had a secretary. Her name was Willie Mackey, and over the coming days and weeks, the two, Reverend Walker and Mrs. Mackey, set to work turning this jigsaw into coherent prose. You see, there hadn't been enough space in the newspaper to complete the letter. So Reverend King asked, again, friendly cons, to please give him any scrap of paper they could get their hands on. And they did. So he completed the letter, almost completed the letter, on these scraps of paper, which were then smuggled out of the prison, given to the Reverend Walker and his secretary, and essentially completed by them. Eventually, his lawyers managed to get the state authorities to agree that he could have writing material. So he was then able to complete the letter, final couple of pages, on a legal pad. As I understand it, that legal pad or the pages still had to be smuggled out of the prison, but nevertheless, out they went. Now, King was released from prison fairly quickly. He was only in for about a month. But that's not the point, because this 7,000 word letter had been written in prison, and that gave it a legitimacy that it would not otherwise have had. The New York Times magazine for one Sunday wanted to publish the letter, but the publishers of the magazine spiked it. So a competitor newspaper, the New York Post, then published unauthorized extracts in their Sunday magazine. I say unauthorized. I doubt very much if Reverend King was really all that bothered, because this was about getting his writings into the general world. They were not just being read by his fellow activists; they were being read by the public at large. He'd been arrested in April. By May, the Quakers had got in on the act, and they published at their own expense the full text of what became known as the letter from the Birmingham City Jail. By the end of summer 1963, the Atlantic magazine had published the whole letter. Now, by summer 63, if the Atlantic's got it, everybody's got it. You had to work hard to avoid reading the letter from the Birmingham City Jail. It was a masterstroke, in my opinion, of agitational propaganda. And it all began because the Alabama authorities not only decided to arrest Martin Luther King, they decided to stop him writing to his followers. It was a stupid move on their part, but King's response to it was brilliant. I am quite looking forward to the end of July 2025, when, in theory, Tommy Robinson will be released from whichever prison they're holding him in at the moment. And he will bring his writings, I hope, with him. And we will see, hopefully by the end of this year, the prison writings of Tommy Robinson. The state really has made a big mistake by locking up an activist, an agitator, and then preventing him from communicating with people. It's a big mistake they're making now, and it was just as big as the mistake that the Alabama authorities made in the 1960s. All you do when you try to ban people is you give them a wider audience. So my congratulations to the British authorities for turning Tommy Robinson, who, let's be honest, most people were not big fans of, into the symbol of resistance to this country and what it is trying to do to us. Nice work, boys. Think on, folks.